She climbed down from that wagon with her hands shaking and her dress pulled tight across her back. And before her feet even touched the dirt, the laughter started. 20 men, 1 woman, and the silence from the porch that felt like the whole world holding its breath. Abigail Turner had been sitting in that wagon for 6 hours. 6 hours of dust and dry heat and the relentless Montana sun pressing down on her like a hand trying to push her back into the earth she'd come from. The wooden bench had dug into the backs of her thighs. Her dress, her best dress, the one she'd saved for 3 years, had soaked through with sweat at the collar and beneath her arms. She was a big woman. She had always been a big woman. The kind of big that people noticed before they noticed anything else. Her dress strained across her shoulders and gathered in folds at her waist. Her brown, curly hair had frizzed in the heat and stuck to the back of her neck. Her face was round and flushed red from the sun and the effort of climbing down. She knew exactly what they were seeing. She had been seeing it in people's faces her entire life. "Lord have mercy," one cowboy said, loud enough for everyone to hear. He was leaning against the fence post with his thumbs hooked in his belt, grinning at her like she was the funniest thing he'd seen all summer. "That's the answer to the advertisement?" "Looks like the cook ate the bride," another one said. More laughter. Abigail's hands curled at her sides. She kept her face still. She had learned a long time ago that if she let them see it hurt, it only made things worse. The ranch yard was wide and dusty, packed dirt baked hard by weeks of summer heat. There were 20 men at least. Some of them weren't even laughing. They were just watching, which was almost worse. And on the porch of the main house stood a man who wasn't laughing at all. He was tall, not the tallest man she'd ever seen, but the kind of tall that came with weight behind it, the kind of tall that meant he'd been working his whole life. He wore a dark shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows and a hat that had seen better years. He had a short goatee going gray at the edges and eyes that were watching her from across the yard with an expression she couldn't read. Samuel Carter. She recognized him from the one photograph his letter had included. Abigail made herself walk toward him. Every step felt like it was underwater. The laughter hadn't fully stopped. It had shifted to whispers and elbows into ribs, and the kind of smirking that men do when they think they're being subtle. She stopped at the base of the porch steps. Up close, Samuel Carter's eyes were darker than she'd expected. Brown, nearly black in the shade of the porch roof. They moved over her face. Not her body, just her face. She opened her mouth, and what came out was the sentence she had rehearsed on the wagon ride. The one she'd been saying her whole life in different forms. "Sir," her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "I know you weren't expecting. I understand if this isn't what you were—" She stopped, swallowed, started again. "No man wants to marry a woman like me. I understand that. I've always understood that. But I can cook better than anyone you've ever hired. I can preserve, salt, bake, smoke, and stretch a pound of flour further than you'd believe possible. I've been running a kitchen since I was 9 years old, and I have never once let anyone in my care go hungry." She looked directly at him. "That's what I'm offering you, Mr. Carter. Not beauty, just work." The yard had gone quiet. Not all at once. It took a few seconds for the whispering to die out, for the men to realize that something had shifted in the air. But it did go quiet. Samuel Carter looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached up and took off his hat. It was a small thing, but she'd been watching people her whole life, watching them the way you do when you've been overlooked so long that you learn to read everything in gestures. And something about the way he took off that hat made her breath catch. "Miss Turner," he said. His voice was low, not unkind. "I didn't send for a pretty face." He held her gaze. "I sent for someone strong enough to survive this land." He put his hat back on and came down the 2 porch steps and picked up her trunk like it weighed nothing. "I'll show you the kitchen," he said, and he walked right past her toward the side of the house. Abigail stood in the dirt for exactly 2 seconds. Then she followed him. Behind her, she heard one of the hands mutter something. She didn't catch the words. She didn't need to. She'd heard every version of that sentence before. She kept walking. "Before we go any further into what happened in that kitchen, I need to know something. Where are you right now as you listen to this? Driving home after a long day? Sitting in your kitchen? Standing in a place where you once felt small? Grab yourself some water, maybe some coffee. Get comfortable. Because what happens next in Abigail's story is about more than just survival. It's about the moment we stop apologizing for taking up space in the world. The kitchen at Red Willow Ranch was a disaster. That was the first thing she thought when Samuel pushed open the door and set her trunk down. Not in a dramatic way. She'd seen worse, much worse, in the orphanage years when the building was falling down around them. But in the way of a room that had been used hard and tended to carelessly for a long time. The wood stove was caked with old grease. The shelves were uneven, loaded with unlabeled tins stacked in no particular order. The work table had a crack running down the middle that had been patched badly with pine tar. The floor had been swept recently, but not well. She stood in the middle of it and turned in a slow circle. "Cook quit 3 weeks ago," Samuel said. He was leaning in the doorway, watching her. "Before that, the one before him quit in April. We've been managing on salt beef and beans since then." "How many men?" Abigail asked. 22, plus myself. 3 meals a day, breakfast and supper. Midday, they take hardtack if they're out on the range." She was already at the shelves, pulling down tins and reading them, or trying to, since half weren't labeled at all. She pried one open and sniffed it. "Cornmeal. Weevils." She set it aside. "What's your supply situation?" "Monthly delivery from Harrow's in town. Next one's in 10 days. "And the smokehouse?" A pause. She looked back at him. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise, more like recalibration. Like he'd been expecting her to ask about her sleeping quarters or the terms of their arrangement. And instead, she was asking about the smokehouse. "East side of the barn," he said. "Half a hog left from spring. Some venison. One of the hands shot a deer last week." "Is the venison dressed?" "Hanging." "Good." She set another tin aside. "Baking powder? Still good?" She turned to look at him fully. "I'll need the weevil grain replaced. I can work around the rest for the first week. But after that, I'll need to know your budget per head per day." Samuel was quiet for a moment. "You're not going to ask about the arrangement?" he said. "The terms? Your room?" "I'll ask about those tonight," Abigail said. "Right now, your men haven't had a proper meal in 3 weeks, and it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I'd like to have something on the table by 6. He looked at her. Then, for the first time, the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but something in that direction. "Room's a second door down the hall," he said. "You can settle your trunk after supper." He straightened up from the door frame. "I'll send one of the hands to carry water." "I can carry my own water," Abigail said. "I know you can," Samuel said. "I'll send one anyway." He left. The hand who came to carry water was named Pete Dillard. He was maybe 19, red-headed with freckles across his nose, and the look of someone who had been told to do something he found embarrassing. He stood in the kitchen doorway with 2 empty buckets and stared at her like she was a problem he didn't know how to solve. "Mr. Carter sent me," he said. "I can see that. Fill them at the pump and bring them back. Both of them full." Pete didn't move. "You're really going to cook?" She stopped moving and looked at him. He had the grace to flush red under his freckles. "I mean," he started. "I'm really going to cook," Abigail said. "Both buckets, please. And when you come back, you can tell me which of your men have dietary issues. Bad teeth, stomach trouble, anything like that." He blinked. "Why would you need to know that?" "Because if a man has bad teeth and I serve him hardtack, he goes hungry," Abigail said. "If I know ahead of time, I can make sure he doesn't." Pete stared at her for another second. Then he picked up the buckets and went to the pump. He came back with both of them full. And as he set them down, he said quietly, not quite looking at her, "Old Hector, he's one of the senior hands. He's got real bad teeth. Been having trouble eating anything hard since winter." Abigail nodded. "Thank you, Pete." He left without another word, but he didn't slam the door. She had beans soaking within the hour. She found salt pork behind a barrel in the back, not spoiled, just forgotten, and set it to rendering in the biggest pot she could find. She swept the floor properly this time. She reorganized the shelves in a system she could navigate without looking. Grains left, preserves center, spices right. She made biscuits from scratch. She made enough of them to feed 23 men. She made a pot of beans that would fill a man twice over, seasoned the way she knew to season them. Nothing fancy, just right. The kind of right that came from 20 years of cooking for people who were tired and hungry and needed feeding more than they needed anything elegant. For Hector, who had bad teeth, she set aside a separate portion, softer. She added extra liquid so the beans practically melted and pulled the pork so fine there was nothing to chew. She didn't tell anyone she'd done that. She just set it on the table in a bowl, slightly apart from the others, with a small cloth over it to keep it warm, and said nothing. The bell rang for supper at 6 o'clock. The men filed in the way men do when they've been told there's food but don't entirely believe it. Cautiously, the way you approach something that might disappoint you. They took their seats at the long tables and looked at the pots and the biscuit baskets, and their faces did that particular thing that happens when a person smells something good and isn't sure yet if they're allowed to feel hopeful. Tom Briggs, the man who'd made the first crack when she stepped off the wagon, sat at the far end of the table and made a point of sighing loudly before he touched anything. "Let's see what the big woman can do," he said to no one in particular, to everyone. The table went quiet in that uncomfortable way where everyone heard it and no one said anything. Abigail ladled beans into the first bowl, then the second. She set the biscuit basket in the middle of the table and went back to the stove. She didn't look at Tom Briggs. She didn't look at anyone. She heard the moment the first man took his first bite, not because of any noise, because of the absence of it. The table had been noisy with the scraping of chairs and the settling of bodies and the small talk of men who'd worked all day together. And then, one by one, those sounds stopped. Pete Dillard was the first one to say anything. "God," he said, not loud, almost reverent. "God, that's—" He reached for a second biscuit without finishing the sentence. Tom Briggs ate his whole bowl before he said another word. Then he pushed it forward toward the center of the table and said, louder than he needed to, "Any more of that left?" Abigail looked at him. "Plenty," she said. She filled his bowl again. She didn't smile. She didn't make anything of it. She just filled his bowl and went back to the stove. At the far end of the table, she heard a very quiet sound, the scrape of a cloth being moved, and then a long pause, and then the sound of a man eating with real, relieved slowness. Hector. The bowl she'd set aside. He didn't say anything. He was an old man, weathered and quiet, and he just sat there eating his softened beans with careful, grateful bites. Abigail turned back to the stove so no one would see her face. Here is what the world rarely asks, and even more rarely answers. What does it mean to see someone? Not to look at them, not to assess them, not to judge their worth by their appearance or their utility, but to truly see them, to notice the pain they don't speak, to anticipate the need they haven't voiced, to offer dignity in the smallest, most necessary ways. Abigail Turner had spent 20 years being invisible to everyone except in the ways they found her useful or lacking. She had learned in those years to see others the way she wished to be seen, completely, specifically, without judgment. And in that kitchen, on that first night, 23 men began to understand, without quite knowing it yet, that they had been seen. Perhaps for the first time in a very long time. The first week was careful. That was the only word for it. 4 people learning to exist in a space built for one, each of them carrying their own particular wariness like a second skin. Caleb woke before dawn every morning, a habit 20 years deep that no amount of exhaustion could break. He'd lie on the pallet by the hearth, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of being in someone else's space. The way Mara moved through her morning routine. The particular silence of a woman who had learned to be alone and wasn't sure yet what to do with company. Samuel ate at the back table. Abigail brought him coffee without being asked, the way she brought coffee to all the men. But there was something different in the way she set his cup down, more careful, more deliberate, like she was aware of him in a way she wasn't aware of the others. "How long were you in the orphanage?" Samuel asked one evening, after the men had gone. Abigail didn't turn from the pot she was scrubbing. "From age 4 until I was 17, and then I worked in the kitchen. At the orphanage first, then for a hotel in Billings, then private families. I've been cooking professionally for 12 years. "Why'd you answer the advertisement?" She was quiet for a moment. "The hotel closed. The family I worked for last moved east. The woman I cooked for before that passed away." She paused. It seemed like the right time to try something different. Samuel set down his cup. "Miss Turner," he said. She turned. "I should tell you something before you settle in completely." He looked at her with that careful expression. "The men out there, some of them are good, some of them are just hard. And some of them are the kind of hard that doesn't get softer no matter what you do." "I know," Abigail said. Tom Briggs, specifically. I know, she said again. Samuel looked at her for a long moment. You're not afraid of him? I've been cooking for difficult men my whole life, Mr. Carter. The key is not caring whether they like you. The key is making sure they need you. Something shifted in Samuel's face. A muscle moving in his jaw. His eyes went from careful to something else. Something that looked almost like recognition. That's a harder way to live than most people manage, he said. It's the only way I know, Abigail said. The crack came on the 9th day, and it came because of the fence. Caleb had been working on the north pasture fence since morning. 3 posts had heaved out of the ground during the last freeze, and if they weren't reset before the next thaw, the whole line would fail. It was hard work, the ground half frozen and resistant, but it was work he knew how to do. He was driving the 3rd post when he heard the sound behind him. Mara was standing at the edge of the pasture watching him. "You're setting them too shallow," she said. Samuel stopped. The sledgehammer was heavy in his hands. "I've been setting fence posts for 20 years. I'm sure you have. But this ground freezes deeper than whatever ground you were setting posts in before. If you don't go down another 6 inches, they'll heave again come spring." He looked at the post, at the hole he'd dug, at the frozen ground that would require another hour of hard labor to deepen the way she was suggesting. "I know what I'm doing," he said. "I'm not saying you don't know what you're doing in general. I'm saying you don't know this ground specifically. I've been setting posts in this pasture for 6 years. I know how deep they need to go." There was no anger in her voice, just that same direct, specific clarity she brought to everything. But something in Samuel, something that had been compressed by days of being corrected, of not being in charge of anything, including his own competence, finally pushed back. "I'm not your hired hand, Mrs. Whitlock. I'm trying to earn my keep. There's a difference." Abigail went very still, the kind of stillness that meant something important was happening beneath the surface. "I know the difference," she said quietly. "Do you?" The question hung in the cold air between them. Samuel set down the sledgehammer. His hands were shaking, not from cold, but from something else. The particular fury of a proud person being made to feel small, mixed with the shame of knowing that she was right. "I'm sorry," he said finally. The words cost him something. "Don't apologize for your pride," Abigail said. "Just don't let it make you stupid." She walked back toward the cabin, leaving him standing in the half-frozen pasture. He pulled the post back up, dug the hole deeper. 6 inches, just as she'd said. By the time he finished, his hands were raw and his shoulders were burning and the light was failing. But the posts were set right. When he came back to the cabin that evening, Abigail was at the stove. She didn't look up when he entered, but she spoke. "There's hot water in the basin. You'll want to wash before supper." It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't coldness either. It was something in between. The particular, careful neutrality of 2 people who had just discovered the shape of each other's boundaries and were now deciding what to do with that information. Samuel washed his hands in the basin. The water was hot, almost too hot, and it stung the raw places on his palms. He welcomed the pain. It felt honest. That night, after supper, Abigail spoke again. "I'm not trying to make you feel small," she said. She was sitting at the table with her quilting, not looking at him. "But this is my kitchen. I've kept it running for 3 weeks now, and I've done it by knowing what works and what doesn't. If you're going to work here, You need to listen when I tell you how things are done. Not because I think you're incompetent, but because I know what I know." Samuel sat across from her. "You're right, about the posts, about all of it." "I usually am," she said. And then, for the first time since they'd argued, she looked up at him. There was something in her eyes that wasn't anger. It was closer to recognition. "But I could have said it better." "You said it fine. I just didn't want to hear it." She went back to her quilting. The needle moved through the fabric with precise, even strokes. Something shifted in the cabin that night. Not a thaw, exactly. The ice was still there. But there was a crack in it now. A place where the cold could begin, slowly and carefully, to give way to something else. By the end of the first month, the men stopped laughing when she walked through the yard. Not because they decided to like her, not because the cruelty had gone out of Tom Briggs, but because a month of proper meals does something to a man that no amount of moral reasoning can achieve. It makes him think of the person who made them differently. She learned their names, all 22 of them. She learned their habits and their preferences and their small, specific needs in the way that years of orphanage cooking had taught her, not through asking, but through watching. She learned that the wrangler named Cal couldn't eat onions without getting sick, and she adjusted the stew accordingly without making a thing of it. She learned that the Ames brothers, both of them, always ate their biscuits with the butter on the side, and she stopped putting it on top. She learned that Hector always got to supper last because his hip bothered him in the evenings, and she started keeping his plate warm for him. Nobody told her any of this. She just paid attention. And one Thursday evening, 2 weeks in, she came out of the kitchen with the supper pots to find that someone had fixed the work table. The crack down the center, the one patched badly with pine tar, was gone, planed down smooth and rejoined with proper carpenter's glue, clean and even. No note, no explanation. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at it for a long moment. Then she went back to the stove. She didn't say anything to Samuel about it, but that evening when he sat at the back table and she brought his supper over, she set it down in front of him with a small extra thing on the side. A piece of the dried apple cake she'd made from the apples in the root cellar. The kind of thing she'd only made for people she was trying to say something she didn't have words for. He looked at it. He looked at her. She went back to the stove. She heard him eat it in the silence behind her. Pete Dillard came into the kitchen one morning with a question that wasn't quite a question. He stood by the door, turning his hat in his hands, looking everywhere except at her. "My mama used to make biscuits," he said finally. "Like these. Same way." Abigail didn't stop working. "Did she teach you?" "No, ma'am. She died when I was 12. Before she could." Abigail set down her spoon. She turned and looked at him. This boy who had laughed in the yard that first day, who was now standing in her kitchen with grief written plainly across his freckled face. "Would you like to learn?" she asked. Pete looked up. "Really?" "Sunday morning, before the men wake up, if you're serious about it." "I'm serious," Pete said quickly. "I'm very serious." "Then Sunday," Abigail said. She went back to the pot. "And Pete, don't tell the others. Not yet. Let's see if you can manage the dough first." He left grinning. It was Hector who broke through the final wall. He came into the kitchen one evening after supper, moving slowly on his bad hip, and stood in the doorway until Abigail noticed him. "Miss Turner," he said, "got a moment?" "Of course." He came in and sat at the table, careful and deliberate, like a man who had been thinking about something for a long time and had finally decided to say it. "My wife was a big woman," he said. Abigail went very still. "Bigger than you," he continued. "She could carry 2 flour sacks at once and still open the door. She made the best sourdough bread in 3 counties." He was quiet for a moment. "She was the finest person I've ever known." He looked at Abigail directly. "She passed 12 years ago. I haven't talked about her much since." He adjusted his hat. "Thought you ought to know she existed. Thought somebody ought to say it out loud." Abigail's throat was tight. "What was her name?" "Martha," Hector said. The name came out soft, like something precious. "Martha Crane." "Thank you for telling me about her," Abigail said. "Thank you for the soft portions," Hector said. "Every night for a month. You think I didn't notice?" He stood up slowly. "Martha would have liked you considerable." He left before she could respond. Abigail stood at the stove and pressed both hands flat against the work table, the repaired work table, and breathed. Samuel found her there 10 minutes later, still standing, still breathing. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded. She didn't trust her voice yet. He came and stood beside her, not touching, just present. They stood like that for a long moment, 2 people in a kitchen, in the particular comfortable silence that had been growing between them for weeks. "Hector told me about his wife," she said finally. "Martha," Samuel said. "She was something. Died of fever back in '83. He hasn't been the same since." "He said she was big." "She was," Samuel said, "and strong, and the kindest woman I ever met besides my own mother." He paused. "She fed half the valley during the hard winter of '82, kept people alive with nothing but flour and determination." Abigail looked at him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because," Samuel said carefully, "I want you to know that when Hector sees you, he doesn't see someone to laugh at. He sees someone who reminds him of the best person he ever knew." He held her gaze. "And he's not the only one." The kitchen was very quiet. "Mr. Carter," Abigail started. "Samuel," he said. "You've been here a month. You can call me Samuel." "Samuel," she said. The name felt strange in her mouth, intimate. "I should tell you something." He waited. "I've been in a lot of kitchens, a lot of houses, and I've learned to read people quickly because I had to. Because if I couldn't read them, I couldn't survive them." She looked down at her hands. "You fixed my table." "I did." "Why?" Samuel was quiet for a moment. "Because I watched you put your hands on it that first night. The way you pressed your palms flat against it, like you were checking whether it was real." He paused. "I've watched enough people come through who didn't trust that anything solid would hold. I know that look." "And you wanted me to have something solid," Abigail said. "I wanted you to know that some things hold," Samuel said. "If they're built right." She looked at him, this man who had taken off his hat in the yard, who had carried her trunk, who ate supper at the back table every night and helped wash dishes and fixed things without being asked, and spoke to her like she was worth listening to. "Thank you," she said. "You already thanked me," Samuel said. "I told you not to." "I know," Abigail said. "I'm not good at following that particular instruction." The corner of his mouth moved, that almost smile she was learning to recognize. "I've noticed." That night, after Samuel had gone to his room, Abigail sat alone in the kitchen and took stock of her situation. She had been at Red Willow Ranch for 1 month. In that month, she had fed 23 men 3 meals a day. She had organized a chaotic kitchen into something efficient. She had learned the names and needs of every person on the property. She had earned, if not affection, then respect, or at least the absence of mockery, which, in her experience, was often the same thing. And she had, without quite meaning to, begun to think of this place as home. That was dangerous. She knew it was dangerous. Home was not something that had ever lasted for her. Home was something that happened to other people, people who fit, people who belonged without having to earn it every single day. But sitting in that kitchen, with the smell of the day's bread still hanging in the air, with the sound of the ranch settling for the night outside, with the knowledge that upstairs there was a man who had fixed her table because he'd noticed the way she touched it, Abigail allowed herself, for just a moment, to imagine what it might be like if this lasted, if this was real, if she could stay. Victoria Hale arrived in a covered carriage on a Thursday morning in late August, 3 months after Abigail had stepped off that wagon into a yard full of laughter. Abigail was in the kitchen when she heard it. The creak of wheels. The particular sound of expensive horses. She looked through the window and watched a woman step down from the carriage with the practiced grace of someone who had never once doubted that the ground would hold her weight. Victoria was everything the word elegant had been invented to describe. Dark hair pinned perfectly despite the long ride. A traveling dress in deep burgundy that fit her like it had been sewn directly onto her body. A face that was beautiful in the cool, architectural way of women who have always known they were beautiful and have spent years perfecting the expression that reminds other people of it. Pete came into the kitchen, moving fast. "That's Victoria Hale," he said, his voice low. "She and Mr. Carter were engaged 4, maybe 5 years back, before the bad winter. Her family had land adjacent, and it made sense on paper. Then her father lost a land grant dispute, and she went east and married a banker from Philadelphia." "And now she's here," Abigail said. "Banker died back in the spring," Pete said. He looked at Abigail with something careful in his eyes. "I just thought you ought to know." Victoria came to the kitchen door 20 minutes later. She didn't knock. She simply opened the door and stood in the frame, looking at Abigail with the slow, deliberate assessment of a woman evaluating a threat. "You're her," Victoria said. "I'm the cook," Abigail said. "Yes." Victoria's voice was pleasant, the kind of pleasant that has something sharp folded inside it. "I can see that." She moved into the kitchen, trailing one hand lightly along the edge of the work table. "You've been busy." "That's what a cook does," Abigail said. Victoria stopped. She turned and looked at Abigail fully, and the pleasantness in her face shifted into something more direct. "I'm going to be honest with you," she said. "I think you deserve that." Abigail said nothing. "Samuel is a kind man," Victoria said. "He always has been. Kind to a fault, really. He brought home strays when he was a boy, injured animals, children from poor families. He can't help himself." She tilted her head slightly. "He saw an advertisement response from a woman who had nowhere else to go, and he said yes, because that's who he is." She paused. But kindness isn't a foundation, Miss— I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name. Turner, Abigail said. Miss Turner. Victoria smiled. Perfectly. Kindness isn't a foundation. This ranch needs a woman who can manage the social obligations that come with it, the relationships in town, the dealings with the land office, she gestured with one hand, graceful and dismissive at once, presentation of the place. The ranch needed feeding, Abigail said. I'm feeding it. Victoria looked at her. Then she said, still pleasantly, Of course you are. She turned and walked back to the doorway. She stopped there, her back to Abigail. He'll be kind to you as long as you're useful, she said without turning around. That's the most you should expect. I want you to know that going in, so you're not surprised later. She left. Abigail stood absolutely still for 10 seconds. Then she picked up the spoon and went back to the pot and stirred it with the particular controlled violence of a woman who has been doing that her whole life, putting everything she wasn't allowed to say into the work of her hands. That evening, Victoria made her real move. She came with a lawyer, a thin man named Clifford Nash, who carried a leather satchel and had the kind of face that had never been told no by anyone who couldn't afford a better lawyer than him. The original land grant deed, Nash said, pointing to a line on the document, was recorded under Hale family title in 1871. The subsequent sale to your predecessor was conducted under duress, and Mrs. Hale is prepared to file for reclamation of the eastern boundary parcel, approximately 340 acres. Samuel read the documents with no expression. My predecessor paid fair market value. My client disputes the fairness of the market conditions at that time, Nash said. Samuel looked up from the documents. He looked at Victoria, not at Nash. When did you find this evidence? Recently, Victoria said. My husband's estate included a number of my father's old papers. I had them reviewed after he passed. Convenient timing, Samuel said. Victoria's chin lifted half an inch. I didn't choose when my husband died, Samuel. Here is what grief teaches us, if we let it. That loss is not a single event, but a continuing condition. That it shapes us in ways we don't recognize until years later, when we find ourselves making choices based on wounds we thought had healed. Victoria Hale had lost her father's land, lost her engagement, lost her husband. And she had learned, in those losses, that the world takes things from you if you're not strong enough to hold them. She had come back to take something, to prove she could, to prove she was strong enough. But she had miscalculated, because the woman standing in that kitchen was someone who had been losing things her entire life and had learned something different from it. Had learned that the opposite of losing is not taking, it's building. It's creating something solid where there was nothing before. 2 days later, Victoria came to the kitchen alone. She sat at the table, uninvited, and folded her hands on the repaired surface. I'm going to drop the land suit, she said, on one condition. Abigail went very still. You leave quietly, without drama. You tell him you've decided the arrangement isn't what you expected. He'll let you go. He won't push. He's not that kind of man. Victoria leaned forward slightly. You're a practical woman, Miss Turner. You understand trade-offs. You understand that sometimes the sensible thing and the painful thing are the same thing. Abigail was quiet for a long moment. You're afraid of me, she said. Something crossed Victoria's face, fast, almost invisible. But Abigail had spent 29 years reading people in kitchens, and she saw it clearly. "I'm being practical," Victoria said. "You drove 2 hours alone on a weekday afternoon to make a private offer to a cook," Abigail said. "That's not practical. That's afraid." Victoria's chin came up. The composure snapped back into place. "Think about what I've said. You have a few days." She walked to the door. She stopped there and turned, and for just a moment the architecture of her face shifted. The beautiful, carefully constructed expression broke slightly at the edges. "He fixed your table," Victoria said. Her voice was very quiet. "He never fixed anything for me." She left. Abigail sat down and pressed both palms flat against the repaired surface. She sat there for a long time. That evening she told Samuel everything, the offer, the land, the condition. She told him about Victoria's face at the door when she said, "He fixed your table." When she finished, Samuel was very still. "Pack your trunk," he said. The bottom dropped out of Abigail's chest. "Pack your trunk," he said again, "because in the morning, I'm driving you to town myself." He crossed back to the table. "And you are going to stand in the Mill Haven General Store, and Clifford Nash is going to hear directly from me that no condition involving Miss Abigail Turner will ever be entertained on this ranch." His jaw was tight. "That woman does not get to walk onto my land and make private offers to people under my roof. That ends today." Abigail looked at him. "The land, 340 acres. Samuel, that's—" "I know what it is," he said. "I know the numbers." He looked at her directly. "A man who trades away the people in his house for land doesn't deserve the land." And there it was, the question that had been hanging between them for 3 months, the question Victoria had tried to exploit, the question that every person who has ever been overlooked, ever been judged by their appearance, ever been told they don't belong, carries with them every day. What are you worth? Not what you can do, not how useful you are, but you, the irreducible fact of your existence. What is that worth? Samuel Carter had just answered. The confrontation with Nash lasted 11 minutes. Samuel spoke. Nash listened with the expression of a man recalculating his position. Victoria stood in the doorway of the land office and said nothing, which was the loudest thing Abigail had ever heard. But Victoria wasn't finished. She had one more move, and she made it 3 days later at the monthly town meeting in Mill Haven. The town hall was the largest building in the county, which meant it held about 90 people before it got uncomfortable. By the time Samuel's wagon pulled up, it was already close to full. Abigail climbed down and stood in the street for a moment, taking in the faces turning toward her. Some curious, some cool. A few wearing the particular expression of people who had already formed an opinion and were checking to see if reality confirmed it. She kept her chin level and walked through the door. Samuel was beside her, not holding her arm, not steering her, just beside her at the same pace, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Tom, Pete, and Hector came through the door behind them. She heard the room shift. Not loudly, just the small sounds of people recalibrating. The murmur, the turned heads, the particular quality of attention that a room gives to something it didn't entirely expect. They took seats near the middle. Abigail sat with her hands in her lap and her back straight and her face completely still. The face she had been perfecting since she was 4 years old. The meeting began. Routine business. Boundary surveys, deed disputes. The room was warm, and the proceedings were dull in the way that official things are dull when the real business of the room is something else entirely. Then the land office representative said Samuel Carter's name, and Victoria stood up. She didn't wait to be called on. She stood and she turned and she looked directly at Abigail, and she said, in the carrying voice of a woman who had spent her whole life making rooms listen to her, "I think this county deserves to know what kind of arrangement Samuel Carter is operating at Red Willow Ranch." The room went very quiet. Samuel started to stand. Abigail put her hand on his arm. He stopped. She stood up instead. She stood up in the middle of the Millhaven Town Hall in her best dress, which was not as fine as Victoria's dress, and never would be, with her brown curly hair pinned back and her hands steady at her sides. And she looked at Victoria Hale and she said clearly, so the whole room could hear it, "The arrangement at Red Willow Ranch is that 23 men eat 3 meals a day and nobody goes hungry. That's the arrangement. I'm the cook. I've been the cook for 3 months." A beat of silence. "And in those 3 months," she continued, "I have learned the name of every man on that ranch, what they can eat and what makes them sick, who needs extra bread and who needs their portions softened because their teeth hurt. I have learned that Pete Dillard's mother made biscuits the same way I do, and that the Ames brothers take their butter on the side, and that Hector Crane hasn't eaten a hot meal without pain in 12 years, until I made it my business to see that he did." She heard something move in the room. Not words, just a collective breath. A shift in the quality of attention. "I came to Red Willow Ranch with nothing," she said. "I came with one trunk and a skill and a willingness to work. Nobody offered me charity. I earned my place." She paused. "If there is an arrangement at that ranch worth discussing, it is that Samuel Carter is the kind of man who hires people for what they can do rather than what they look like. I would think this county would consider that a quality worth having in its citizens." She sat down. The room was completely still. Tom Briggs, behind her, made a sound. Then he started clapping. It was slow at first, deliberate, the way Tom Briggs did everything, like he was daring someone to tell him not to. Then Pete joined him. Then Hector, careful and measured. Then someone in the back row. Then someone on the left side. Then, and Abigail would think about this moment for the rest of her life, old Mr. Hargrove, who owned the general store and had been in Millhaven longer than anyone, stood up and clapped with the slow, nodding satisfaction of a man who had been waiting for someone to say a particular thing for a long time. Victoria sat down. She sat down without saying another word, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she did not look at Abigail again for the rest of the meeting. Outside afterward, in the street, Pete was talking too loudly, the way he did when he was covering emotion. Tom was standing with his arms crossed, looking at everything except Abigail. Hector came and stood beside her. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in his slow, careful way, "My wife was a big woman, bigger than you. She could carry 2 flour sacks at once and still open the door. She made the best sourdough bread in 3 counties. He was quiet for a moment. "She passed 12 years ago. I haven't talked about her much since." He adjusted his hat. "Thought you ought to know she existed. Thought somebody ought to say it out loud." He walked back toward the wagon. Samuel appeared at her shoulder. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just stood there, and she could feel the warmth of him at her side. "You didn't need me to say anything for you," he said finally. "I told you I could handle a room," she said. "You told me you could handle a kitchen," he said. "I should have known that covered most things." She almost laughed. She actually laughed. It came out surprised and real, the kind of laugh that doesn't ask permission. He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked back to the wagon together, and in that moment, something fundamental shifted. Not just in how the town saw her, but in how she saw herself. For 29 years, Abigail Turner had been apologizing for taking up space, for being too big, for being too visible, for being, in every possible way, too much. She was done apologizing. True strength, the kind that lasts, the kind that changes things, doesn't come from being born into the right body, or the right circumstances, or the right family. It comes from deciding that the space you occupy in the world is yours by right, not by permission, not by proving yourself useful enough that people tolerate you, but by the simple, radical act of refusing to shrink. Abigail Turner had just refused to shrink, and the world, in that small Montana town, had shifted to make room for her. Victoria withdrew the land suit 2 days later. The message came through Nash's office. No explanation. Just a single line stating that the claim was being dropped, effective immediately. Samuel read the letter at the kitchen table. He set it down and looked at Abigail. "She's gone," he said. "Back to Philadelphia, according to Hargrove. Left on the morning stage." Abigail was at the stove, her hands moving through the familiar motions of the evening meal. "And the land?" "Stays ours."
"All of it." She nodded. She didn't stop working. Samuel was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up and walked to where she was standing. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I want you to have this," he said. She wiped her hands on her apron and took it. Inside was a small leather-bound notebook. On the first page, in Samuel's careful handwriting, was written, "Red Willow Ranch, Kitchen Management, Abigail Turner, Head of House." She stared at it.
"Head of house," she said.
"That's the correct title," Samuel said. "I've had my lawyer draw up paperwork. It formalizes your position here, your wages, your authority over the household operations, your legal standing." He held her gaze. "You belong here. I want that to be a fact that the law recognizes, not just something I know." Abigail looked at the notebook in her hands. She thought about a 4-year-old in an orphanage kitchen who learned very early that belonging was something that happened to other people.
"I belong here," she said quietly, testing the words.
"Yes," Samuel said simply. "You do."
She closed the notebook. She set it on the shelf. And she turned around and looked at him. This man who had fixed her table without being asked, who had stood beside her in a town hall, who had given her a notebook with her name in it. "Samuel Carter," she said, "are you ever going to say the rest of it?" He blinked. Something in his face broke open, surprised and then not surprised. And then something warm and certain and entirely unguarded. "I've been working up to it," he said. "You fixed my table in the first week," she said. "You've been working up to it for 3 months." "I'm a slow man," he said. "I know you are," she said. "I've been patient." He looked at her for a long moment.
Then he crossed the kitchen, and he stood in front of her, close enough that she could see the gray in his goatee,
and the lines at the corners of his eyes. "I would like to ask you to stay here," he said. "Not as the cook, not as head of house, as the person this place belongs to, same as it belongs to me." She looked at him for 3 full seconds. "Yes," she said. They were married in November, in the Mill Haven Church, on a cold, bright morning with snow just starting to come off the mountains to the north. Tom Briggs stood in the front row in a clean shirt. Pete cried, which he would deny until his dying day. Hector wore his good hat with the eagle feather. The minister said the words, and Samuel said the words, and Abigail said the words. And when it was done, the whole of Red Willow Ranch walked out into the November cold and ate the food Abigail had spent 3 days preparing, because she had insisted on making her own wedding supper, and nobody had argued with her, because nobody argued with Abigail Turner Carter about what happened in her kitchen. Years passed. The ranch grew. They took on more land to the north. They built a second smokehouse. They hired 3 more hands, and Abigail learned their names and their needs before their 2nd week was done. Pete married a school teacher from Billings and brought her to the ranch for Sunday dinner. Tom Briggs never became a warm man, but he became over time a different kind of hard, the kind that had softer edges. Hector stayed until he was 71. When he finally retired to his daughter's house in Billings, Abigail packed him a box of provisions for the road. All of it soft. All of it right. He stood in the yard holding the box and looked at her with those tired old eyes and said, "Martha would have liked you considerable." She hugged him. He stood stiff and surprised for a moment. Then his arms came up and he held on. One brief, careful moment. He got in the wagon. He didn't look back. Abigail stood in the yard and watched him go until the road bent and the wagon disappeared. And then she pressed her hands flat against her apron, and she breathed. Samuel came and stood beside her. He didn't say anything. He took her hand. People in the valley talked about Red Willow Ranch for years, and what they said most often was not about the land or the cattle or the legal troubles of the early days. What they said was, "If you're passing through and you're hungry, stop at Carter Ranch. There's a woman there who feeds people like family." On the evening of their 5th anniversary, Samuel washed the dishes. Abigail stood at the stove and listened to the sound of it. The water, the clink of the bowls, the particular comfortable domestic quiet of a man who washed dishes beside her every evening because he wanted to. She turned around and looked at him. He looked back at her. 5 years, he said. 5 years, she said. He dried the last bowl and set it on the shelf. He hung up the cloth. He turned and leaned against the counter and looked at her with that expression she knew completely now, open and steady and entirely without distance. "Any regrets?" he said. She considered it honestly. "The pine tar patch on the table was better than you think," she said. "The repair you did is smoother, but the original had character." He looked at her. "That is not what I asked." "I know," she said. She crossed the kitchen and stood in front of him. She pressed her palms flat against his chest. He put his arms around her. Outside, the Montana evening was going dark, the first stars coming up over the mountains to the west. Inside the kitchen of Red Willow Ranch, Abigail Turner Carter stood in the arms of the man who had taken off his hat. And she was home. Not because she had changed, not because the world had gotten kinder, but because she had walked into a yard full of laughter
and kept walking. And somewhere between the first supper and the town hall and the notebook with her name on it, she had stopped asking permission to belong. She had just belonged. If this story moved you, if you felt something when Abigail stood up in that town hall, if you've ever been told you don't fit and kept showing up anyway, then you understand why these stories matter. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, someone who's been made to feel small, someone who's wondering if there's a place in the world for people like them. There is. It lives in the moments we choose each other, in the tables we fix, in the soft portions we make without being asked, in the courage it takes to stand up and say, "I belong here," not because you gave me permission, but because I decided. Thank you for listening, and remember, you could be someone's Samuel Carter. You could be the person who sees what everyone else overlooks. All you have to do is take off your hat and say, "I didn't send for a pretty face. I sent for someone strong enough to survive."